We're here to discuss the data findings from the 2021 U.S. Energy and Employment Report. We're going to have a brief introduction from Anthony Armley, the Federal Coordinator for the NETL Regional Workforce Initiative, followed by the keynote from David Kaiser, Senior Advisor in the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Jobs. Once again, the topic of this webinar is to discuss regional and also national results from the latest U.S. Energy and Employment Report. And with that, we will begin. One more thing, again, if you're not on mute already, please mute. And finally, at the end of this, we're going to have a brief discussion about some of the stuff that we learned today. And if you have a question for any of the presenters during that section, please use the chat function and we'll try our best to get to your questions. So with that, Anthony, are you ready?
Ready.
There you go.
All right. Okay, can you hear me, Matt?
Yes.
All right, thanks for joining us today. My name is Anthony Armley. I'm the NETL Regional Workforce Initiative Federal Coordinator. I'd like to provide just a brief introduction for those unfamiliar to our Regional Workforce Initiative, and it'll be an update on some of our efforts for those who are familiar with what we do. Slide, please. So the mission of our Regional Workforce Initiative is essentially, it's an extension of the mission of our lab, and that's to get technologies to market, but we're focusing on a collaborative means in our region. So we do this in a few different ways. We try to collaborate, coordinate, communicate with our regional stakeholders. We don't limit it to the region, but that is an emphasis. We do it in a number of ways, one of which is webinar series, such as today, where we put on workforce or economic development type webinars. We also do Energy 101 webinars from time to time, where we'll take a technical topic at the lab, try to introduce it at a high level, to introduce it to people so they understand what NETL does, why it's important, the impact that research could have on the economy, and then from a workforce perspective, what skills might be needed to support jobs, especially in the region. Slide, please. So the Regional Workforce Initiative started in 2017 under the administration's priorities to help reskill Americans, focus on jobs, and provide good opportunities for the American people. We focus on the Appalachian Region for a number of reasons, a couple of which are historically it's been a critical region for U.S. energy production. Obviously, the land here has tons of coal, tons of gas, and so it's a very ripe area for energy production. With that being said, we think there's a huge manufacturing renaissance, and you're starting to see that with the petrochemical industry, CO2 to other products, things like that. Additive manufacturing, advanced manufacturing techniques are improving. And so this Appalachian region there's a big opportunity here, and we're trying to take advantage of it by being a convener in this region. Next slide, please. Some metrics, just to give you a snapshot of some of the reach that we've had. You're talking 800 plus individual stakeholders that we network with. When we started in 2017, obviously that number was 0. So we're proud of the growth that we've had. We engage with over 400 different organizations in the region. On our webinar series that I talked about, we've had over 1,100 registrants in the past year on our various webinars. And then we put out a monthly e-note where we talk about funding opportunities, high-level newsworthy items coming out of our lab, trends in employment, and a few other miscellaneous types of items. The big one, though, really is the funding opportunities that we try to put together for everybody to know about. We've had a lot of people reach out and say, hey, if it wasn't for you guys making us aware of this funding opportunity, we would have had no idea and wouldn't have won, hundreds of thousands of dollars for future efforts. So we're proud of that. I think that's a huge impact that we're making. And we're almost at 300 people now on our e-note subscription. So if you know of anyone that might find value in it, all they have to do is go to our website. And if you go to the chat function on this webinar, I put the link to our Regional Workforce Initiative website. There's a button there right in the middle that they can literally click it, and it'll opt them in for that e-note. Slide, please. In 2019, prior to the pandemic, the U.S. Skilled Technical Workforce National Science Board put out a report that said around the year 2022, there's going to be a significant shortfall of nearly 3.4 million skilled technical workers for a couple of reasons. They said continuing retirement of the baby boomers is going to be a big contributor to that, as well as the tendency of job skills, the requirements of job skills to increase over time. So again, that statistic came out in 2019 prior to the pandemic. But really, if you look at that and think about it, it's an opportunity for America to try to shore up onshore manufacturing capabilities and secure independence even further. And so what we're trying to do is again, be a convener in the region, talk about it, host webinars like this, introduce topics, introduce funding opportunities to people that may not otherwise have known about it. And so that's the effort we're trying to make here to shorten that gap of 3.4 million skilled technical workers. Slide, please. Some key outcomes to date that we're proud of since inception. I highlighted two for today's talk. I mean, the integration of a workforce work plan that I'll talk about here in about a slide or two is something that we're really proud of, and I think the region will find value in that, especially the technical and community colleges. The other one is the establishment of a new network of regional stakeholders, and that's really come in a couple of ways. Number one, just by the outreach that we've had with this regional workforce initiative, but also, and this is a good segue into my next slide, Matt, we created an innovation group called the Regional Advanced Manufacturing and Energy Innovation. And in 2019, Catalyst Connection hosted us for a directors roundtable at Hazelwood Green to talk about just issues in the region pertaining to energy and advanced manufacturing. And we came up with a list as a group of issues. And so what our director, Brian Anderson, asked of us was, why don't we lead a working group or an innovation type group where it's open to the public and you're welcome. Anyone listening in is welcome to join. We meet quarterly and we usually talk about one or two of these items. I believe our 5th meeting is coming up December 2nd. And so we'll have some, if you're a subscriber to our email, you'll get that invitation to join. We've typically had about 40 to 50 that have joined us for these discussions. And we talk about anything from how to support regional energy and advanced manufacturing ecosystem, engaging with the labs. How do you work with NETL? How do you apply for funding opportunities? These are topics that we talk about in these meetings. How do you promote workforce and entrepreneurial type talent? Just like engaging across the national lab complex and creating connections and talking about, well, what is all these different stakeholders, what are they doing with energy? What are they doing with additive and advanced manufacturing? Everybody feels like they know what other organizations are doing, but the reality is things are changing so fast and everybody's so busy with their own work that sometimes it's hard to keep up with what others are doing. So what we try to do on these quarterly calls is to give a few different organizations in the region an opportunity to speak and give a 15-minute update on what they're doing, what they've been up to the last 3 to 6, 12 months for the region to hear about. And so this is that platform to get everyone who wants to be involved in something like this, that opportunity to have these discussions. Slide, please. So I mentioned that workforce work plan. So this past year, we implemented this idea across NETL, and the idea is any technology that's 3 to 5 years from commercialization, the technology manager at NETL will basically answer 3 to 5 questions that I put together for the workforce work plan. And it's, what is the technology? What are the jobs that could be created from this technology that's estimated to be 3 to 5 years from commercialization? What are the skills or the unique skills that would be needed to support this job in the workplace? And then are you aware of any current training that's geared towards this? And we take that information and we're going to provide it. That's what I'm about to say. I created a spreadsheet and made it very, very clear. You can sort through it by skills. You can sort through it by education type, whether for our academia to really get their hands on this, and for more than anything, just to have the information. You know, they may have a construction management program, but they may not know about these specific skills that we're going to provide them that now in about to be 2022, we feel could be needed. So it gives them time to implement curriculum change. And I think in the coming years, this is something that I had a call yesterday with some other DOE national labs, NREL and Argonne, and I talked about this, and they're interested in implementing something like this in the future. So thinking a couple years down the road, how big could we make this? How much information can we extract from our labs to provide to academia to make these changes? That way, when the employers are ready to hire these new people out of school, whether it's, again, certificate program, 2-year associate's program, undergrad, master's, they have people they can hire that have the skills that the employer needs. And so we're just getting started with this workforce work plan, but I can see where it's headed, and I'm really excited about it. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to give a quick update on the Interagency Working Group. So in July, the U.S. Department of Commerce's Economic Development Agency, also known as EDA, they announced $3 billion in new economic development funding, $300 million of which is to support America's coal communities. So right here in our backyard, the Appalachian region, there's a huge opportunity for funding to improve infrastructure, to improve skills. There's a lot of different areas that's really offering opportunities to. Tomorrow, I believe there is a webinar that they'll be hosting on where to start, a webinar for the energy communities that are starting a transformation. I believe it's an hour and a half, and you can go to energycommunities.gov to get more information on that. So far, the Interagency Working Group has held a series of 11 in-person and virtual community meetings that started in the summer and into the fall. And so they're really just listening. They're trying to learn about what are the issues in these areas, how can we help, and then trying to implement that into some of these funding opportunities that you're seeing. Next slide, please. So here's my contact information. Again, I just wanted to give you an introduction if you weren't aware of our regional workforce initiative, or an update if you were, on some of the latest things going on. And Matt, I'd like to send it back to you so we can hear about our 2021 U.S. Energy and Employment Report. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, again, if you'd like to get more information or reach out or connect further or be part of the RWFI network, please visit the website netl.gov/RWFI or send Anthony email and we can connect. So without further ado, our keynote for today, David Kaiser. David, are you ready to give us some great information?
I'm ready. Thank you, Matt. I will start out just by introducing myself. My name is David Kaiser. I'm a senior advisor in the DOE Office of Energy Jobs. I'm actually on detail over there from the National Renewable Energy Lab. And Matt and I go way back. He and I both were around when the U.S. Energy and Employment Report was started, going back to, I think, 2015, after the first Department of Energy Quadrennial Energy Review. So we both have been working at this for a long time. And so I'll be talking today about employment trends from 2019 to 2020 and in 2020, both nationally, and then I'll drill down into the Appalachian region, specifically in your neck of the woods, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia. But before I do that, I'm going to go off the rails and talk a little bit about something that Anthony said, because I think it's incredibly important, and that is about workforce retirements. And I'm just going to make a quick comment about it because, you know, when you look at these regional differences, it is something that is extraordinarily important, you know, whether you're looking at that by region or you're looking at it by technology, because sometimes you have technologies like nuclear, or we've seen this with hydropower, where they're older technologies where you do have a really high concentration of that baby boomer workforce, and they are having a hard time replacing those workers on the younger end of things. Whereas at the same time, you have some other workforces like solar that is quite a bit younger, where you don't have those kinds of issues. And so we are planning on doing an event with the Energy Futures Initiative, EFI, to talk a little bit more about that nuclear workforce issue. So I'll plug that. We don't have those age distributions in the U.S. Energy Employment Report, but it is something that we've kind of looked at on the side. And, you know, the implications of this go beyond energy jobs. And I'll give you an example here in Colorado. I'm based in Colorado. We had a big energy boom here in the 1970s. And with that energy boom, we had a lot of baby boomers move into the state. And so we have a very high concentration of baby boomers in Colorado because of energy. And at this point, they're retiring. And what is happening in the state is that basically any growth of our economy in any sector is requiring somebody to move into the state to fill a job, or it's resulting in somebody moving into the state. And so we've had really high population growth. And so you can see there where the effect of energy, 50 years ago is having a big impact on the economy right now, whether you're looking at, regardless of sector that you're looking at. And so it is something that I find incredibly interesting, incredibly important. So that said, I will get back on track and come back to the presentation that I actually put together, just planned on talking about today. So let's go to the next slide. So I'll give a little bit of background about the U.S. Energy Employment Report. As I mentioned, we started work on it in 2015. The first one DOE published in 2016, and then 2017, the last one that DOE published before this year was in 2017. The National Association of State Energy Officials, or NASEO, and EFI picked it up. After that, DOE stopped publishing it for a while, and they published it from 2018 to 2020. So we do have a continuous time series. We're lucky to have that. Congress actually mandated the report at this point, and so we are excited to say that it came back to DOE this year. We published it in July, and we plan on publishing the report next year in March. So this is exciting. We are starting work on the next year's report right now. As part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, it is mandated again. And as part of that act, and that act also specifies that we bring it down to the county level, which is great when you're looking at this Appalachian region that doesn't really align, very well with state boundaries. And so we're planning on doing that at the county level. And then the act also mandates that we produce it for U.S. territories as well, which is going to be interesting. It also expands it from being a Department of Energy report to being something that's overseen by multiple agencies, including Department of Labor and Department of Commerce, which houses the census. And so there are some changes in the future if that passes. Those are online. The URLs are on the screen here, or you could just Google it. All those reports are out there. And I'll say that this year is a little bit different because DOE is writing this report in-house. And so if you have any questions today, I will say that one of the things that I would like to do is that if you do have any questions, it helps me understand what it is that you're interested in, that other people are interested in, and that in turn will help writing the report. So if there's any content that we don't have in there right now that you ask about, that certainly is helpful for me, because then maybe that's something that we want to include in the future. So let's go to the next slide. So it's no surprise, I think, to anyone that we had declines in the energy sector in 2020. We had declines economy-wide, and this is no exception. One thing we did see, though, is that the energy sector declined faster than the economy writ large. So the decrease was 10%, or just under 840,000 jobs, whereas economy-wide, the decline was 6%. And that is interesting because the energy sector has historically grown about twice as fast as the economy writ large between 2015 and 2019, when we've been tracking over the whole time before 2020, when we've been tracking jobs. But then this go around this year, the decline was faster. And, you can also put that in context that big part of that 6% decline was in sectors like retail, leisure, hospitality, restaurants, things like that, that are not in the energy sector. And so that 10% decline is a pretty big drop. At the same time, the good news is that most of that decline happened in the first 2 quarters of 2020. Growth in the last 2 quarters of the year was actually positive with 560,000 jobs gained, but that wasn't enough to counter the declines. There were some gains, mostly in, I guess you could consider them renewable or clean sectors with hybrid electric vehicles gaining, along with EVs, wind electric power, and battery storage. So those are the only sectors that actually increased. Let's go to the next slide. At the same time, we do have growth expectations next year, in some cases, fairly significant growth, especially in energy efficiency, expecting 10% growth. The only sector that is not expecting growth is motor vehicles, which is interesting. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But you know, since we did have the positive growth in motor vehicles, in EVs and HEVs, but overall, that sector is not anticipating positive employment growth in 2021. But we shall see. So let's go to the next slide. And I'll give a high-level overview of all of these, you know, major sectors nationally, and then I'll work into some of the regional numbers. But from 2019 to 2020, the biggest decline in terms of percent change was in the fuel sector. And in talking to people about this and trying to figure out what it is that's going on, some of this was actually planned decline that had to do with pipeline construction that actually ended in 2020. And so that's part of the reason why these jobs decreased. But then certainly there were, you know, demand side issues at the same time. And the biggest decreases were in petroleum. You know, and you can think of the demand side changes just in that sector intuitively, what was going on in 2020 with quarantine and folks staying at home. The smallest decrease was really in nuclear fuel. So let's move on to the next slide. And then in energy efficiency actually had the largest declines in levels. The decrease was only 11.4% decrease, but then the actual declines were 272,000 jobs. Most of this was actually in HVAC, whether we're looking at traditional HVAC or Energy Star HVAC. Those were the two biggest declines. If you add in all the HVAC, you'll see, you know, that's the biggest area that was hit. To some extent, lighting was in there as well, but it was primarily HVAC. And let's move into the next, electric power generation. Now, with electric power generation, a lot of this really has to do with previous year's planning. To some extent, it has to do with the pandemic. But you know, when you look at job growth in the wind sector, a lot of that is really just previously planned plants that are being installed and growth in construction in that sector. The biggest decline really is solar photovoltaics. You can think of consumers and rooftop distributed solar. Folks just not wanting that with the uncertainty with the pandemic, probably also having some hesitancy with just, you know, strangers working on your house. But that sector actually does anticipate faster growth in 2021, but we will see. Coal, also, I know that you're interested in that. That was the second largest decline, with a 10.4% decrease, and that shed 8,300 jobs. So the decrease in electric power generation, just keep that in mind. This isn't as big as the decrease in coal fuel, but still a decline. Let's move into the next slide with transmission. The decreases in transmission, distribution, and storage were the biggest in just regular traditional transmission and distribution. Overall, the sector lost about 62,000 jobs, but overwhelmingly, nearly all of this was from the traditional sector. Battery storage did increase a little bit, but overall storage did still decline. And those are just really smaller sectors. When you look at an increase of 850 jobs, it's not a whole lot. Percentage-wise, it's a little bit bigger for that since it's a fairly small sector, but overall, it is not nearly big enough to counter what was going on in traditional. And then moving on to motor vehicles. The decline in motor vehicles was 9% with 231,000 jobs. So not the largest decline, but still pretty close to the 270,000 from energy efficiency. Almost all of this was gas and diesel motor vehicles. With these small increases in hybrids and hybrid electric and electric vehicles, but overall not nearly enough to counter the changes going on in gasoline and diesel. And when we asked employers about the anticipated growth, recall that motor vehicles is the only one that said that they did not anticipate positive growth in 2021. They expected a 1% decline. One of the interesting things to ask would have been why you think that. It's hard to do that in a big survey. We can't really ask open-ended questions like that. But this could be a demand side issue, just anticipated demand, but it also could highly, be tied to supply side issues like semiconductor shortages, or anything tied to labor shortages. So this really could be due to a number of issues, but my suspicion is that this is actually more of a supply side issue than a demand side issue. Whereas with a lot of these other technologies, the anticipated growth probably has a lot more to do with demand. That's pure speculation, but this is my thought about what is going on. Now let's move to the next slide. The 2021 report, we did roll out something new this year, and that has to do with union membership. And so if you compare union membership in this year's report, it is not comparable to union membership in previous year's reports. The reason why we did this is because previous years we were just reporting survey responses. And the problem with that is that we don't think that we were coming up with a sample that was representative of the industry with respect to unions. We think we have something that's more representative with employment and the industries that employment is in and the energy technologies that we cover, but not union membership. If you get a lot of really small businesses, for example, they may not be as likely to be unionized as big businesses, and it's really difficult to actually capture that accurately. And so this year what we did was we combined those survey responses with the current population survey, which is a joint effort between the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Census Bureau. This is the best source of union data that we could find. And what we did was we took those survey responses and then combined that with the current population survey, taking into account things like the industries that are covered in the survey responses, the occupations covered in the survey responses, to come up with a better number. And so these numbers, the union numbers in this year's report, are quite a bit different. But what you can see is that the highest unionization rate is really in some of the older sectors, like nuclear, electric power generation, transmission distribution, natural gas generation, coal, some of the grid sectors, whereas the lower unionization numbers are in renewables, advanced transportation, and some of the fuel sectors. So let's move on to Appalachia. So overall, within the Appalachian region, or in states that are in the Appalachian region. We can't drill down really at much more detail right now. Hopefully in the future we can. But overall in the region, there is a loss of just under 184,000 jobs. The biggest decline is in the largest state, of course, New York, but it's still pretty closely followed by Ohio. So Ohio and New York had some of the biggest drops, and that's followed by Tennessee. Really, the negative growth was led by motor vehicles in that area. But this also is going to differ from state to state. And interestingly, the state with the gains, the least, the most positive gains closest to zero, I suppose, is West Virginia. So West Virginia fared better than other states in that region. So move on then to start out with Pennsylvania. And there's a lot that I could say about every one of these states. It's really hard to refine what it is that I'm going to go over without spending a tremendous amount of time on all of these. So a lot of this is really high level information, but we can split out employment in each state, of course, by energy technology. You've seen that, but then within each technology, there's a set of industries. So every technology has manufacturing, it has professional services, most of them have construction, some in fuels have an extraction component, and so that is a way of distributing energy jobs as well. And it's important to think about when you're thinking about growth or declines in any sector, because some technologies have a higher concentration of certain sectors. So for example, energy efficiency has a larger construction component. Motor vehicles has a larger manufacturing component. And so here in Pennsylvania, you can see that motor vehicles is the largest energy technology, and at the same time, manufacturing is the largest industry. And so those two are going to be correlated. And energy efficiency is the second largest energy technology, while construction is the second largest industry. So let's move to the next slide and look at the changes from 2019 and 2020 in Pennsylvania. We had in Pennsylvania declines in all energy technologies. The biggest declines were really in the fuel sector. Within fuels, that's mostly oil, but then also that's followed pretty closely by natural gas. The smallest declines were in electric power generation. But there were growth in some areas. Hybrid electric vehicles did grow in Pennsylvania, as did electric vehicles. But those are the only two areas to grow, and the job increases in those categories were pretty small compared to the losses elsewhere. And let's move on to Ohio then. Ohio has a higher concentration of motor vehicles than Pennsylvania does. You can see that motor vehicles is almost half of energy jobs in Ohio. That's followed by energy efficiency, which is about a quarter, but motor vehicles is overwhelmingly the largest. Manufacturing as a portion of jobs isn't, that 40%, but it's still large, and that's followed by construction. So again, you can see that correlation there between motor vehicles and manufacturing, energy efficiency, and construction. So let's move on to the changes in Ohio. And the biggest decline in Ohio was in motor vehicles. We're looking at levels of jobs, so it's not surprising because that's the largest energy sector that is in Ohio. And then the smallest declines were in transmission, distribution, and storage. In the fuel sector, most of the declines, similar to Pennsylvania, most of those declines were in oil. So let's move on then to West Virginia. West Virginia has, I know we think of West Virginia as being a lot of coal and fuel, but it has actually the highest concentration of jobs in transmission, distribution, and storage. There are more jobs in that sector than fuels, and the two are fairly close, but the largest is in transmission, distribution, and storage. At the same time, the largest industries in West Virginia, the biggest industry that employs energy workers is construction, but then that's followed by mining and extraction. And so the economy in West Virginia is different than Ohio and Pennsylvania in that regard, because we're not looking at, a very large motor vehicle and energy efficiency. This time we're looking at fuels and transmission. The similarity is the concentration of jobs in construction, but that type of construction is different than Pennsylvania and Ohio. So let's move on to the next slide. And the implications of this in 2020 are really why West Virginia didn't lose as many jobs as other states. Really what happened in that state was that that transmission sector was a source of stability over the pandemic. And there were job gains in that sector. Nearly 7,000 jobs gained in that sector. Motor vehicles doesn't comprise, it's not as big of a chunk of energy jobs in West Virginia, but it still did grow a little bit. It increased 380 jobs, but the declines really are in fuel, 6,800 jobs lost in fuel, and the biggest source of job losses in fuel were in coal. And similar to the national trends, the coal losses in fuel were a lot bigger than coal losses in electric power generation. So even though they went down, fuels is really a bigger source of that than the electric sector. So then let's move on. And I just want to say thank you to you all for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to any questions that you have. It looks like we have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. And again, if I can't get back to you, if I can't answer your question right now, I will be happy to get back to you. And I don't know, Matt, if there's a way to get back to the entire group or not about this, but I will definitely try.
Yeah, we will happily act as a conduit. I want to see if Anthony, if you can join us for this little conversation that we can have, that we have a little bit of time in the discussion section. Yeah, so you brought up a lot of really interesting data. It does show a difference in the Appalachian region versus the national region, and you're able to like highlight some of those differences. I think one of the questions that we've always gotten about this report is some two general questions that may be helpful for people to understand it a little bit. Before I get into the question, I'm sorry. Please make sure to use the chat function to send some questions in for this section, and we'll try our best to get to them. I think people always ask the question, what are you counting as energy efficiency? And also, why include motor vehicles in a energy employment report? So I think you can elaborate on those. I think I know the answers, but let's hear a little bit from you.
Well, Matt, thank you. Matt was very involved in the energy efficiency definitions of the report, and so I know that question is near and dear to your heart. If you go to slide 6, it shows all of the categories that are in energy efficiency. So I'll deal with that first. Really what it is there was just a lot of discussion in the Department of Energy about what counts as energy efficiency. And nailing down a definition of this is extraordinarily difficult because it seems like everyone uses a different definition. But it still is an important part of energy consumption in the United States and changes in energy consumption in the United States. And the Department of Energy itself does a lot of work in energy efficiency. Pacific Northwest National Lab, for example, runs economic impact estimates for Energy Star certifications. And so it very much is an important part of energy. And then the definitions, though, of the sector, of the components of efficiency, which are listed on this slide, just has to do with, how that energy is actually consumed or how energy use is mitigated in various ways. And so this is really the definition that we arrived at after much discussion. And please feel free to add in anything that you might have to say about that, Matt. I don't know.
I think it's a good segue into why we discussed why motor vehicles was important as well too. I think
yes.
The answer is
it's a huge energy consumption in the United States. It's a big source of energy, and really, it's employment in this sector is incredibly important because that includes vehicles, it includes car manufacturing, things like that. But if we're thinking about transitions from ICE vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles, to EVs, hybrid EVs, whatever else we have, there's so much discussion about that. The implications are huge because we're moving from something that is incredibly complicated, where you have a lot of parts dealers and things like that, to something that isn't complicated or is significantly less complicated, that uses different parts. Not only that, but repair services are included in that motor vehicles sector. And so when you're thinking about this energy consumption, the implications to the repair sector are very different from combustion engines to EVs. And so tracking employment in that sector is going to be incredibly important moving forward, thinking about the workforce implications of any changes in that area, any policy decisions in that area. It's going to be a big deal.
And just a technical question, since we are looking at a very, very unique time period in the U.S. economy in 2020, when was the specific quarter studied for this last report? What was the quarter? What month?
So this year is different in that we tracked it all year, but the quarter for the data that's in the report is the second quarter. But we're taking an annualized number, but really the survey goes out at the end of the year, but the question is at the end of the second quarter.
Okay, so we could be seeing the tail end of the most probably job sheds that were occurring because of the pandemic. Correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And, we do, I think that's a big part of why some of the anticipated growth numbers are so big in 2021. Although, really, I think if you go back and ask someone, when this survey went out last year, if they anticipated growth as, say, it was demand-driven growth, I think in terms of job numbers, they may have expected to be able to hire more workers than they actually could. And so I think back then the tightness in the labor force maybe wasn't known as well. And so that could certainly dampen some of those anticipated growth numbers. So that has to do with when that survey went out as well.
Okay, great. We're getting some questions in, which is great. Let's see. So is there a prediction for the future? Some predictions look past and project into the future. Some predictions are based on major changes if COVID goes away, how does that affect predictions? That maybe also ties into something I wanted to bring up, which is the modeling versus what we're doing here is surveying and how they could be used together.
And I'll address one of the questions that someone put in the chat, Jonathan. We actually do have demographic data in the report. I just didn't include it in this presentation. It is something that the administration wants to see over time. I mean, everyone is interested in this. The demographic data that we do have in there is limited to gender, ethnicity, race, and veteran status. The only age question that we ask is over the age of 55. So I didn't put that in this presentation, probably should have. So apologize for that. The thing that is lacking, though, is really a good age distribution. And that age distribution is important. Maybe we can do side studies that have to do with that because, you know, going back to what Anthony said earlier about retirements, what you can do is if you know the age distribution of your workforce, you could just age that over time and then use something like BLS data. We did this for hydropower, use BLS data to, you know, have people exit the workforce and then use CDC data to estimate mortality because that happens. And from that, you can come up with hiring needs in an industry, even if there's no growth, just to replace workers. I wish that was in the user, but it's not. It is a possibility for some side studies.
Is the job change picture more one of discipline rather than sector? For example, if welders' employment went up or down across sectors, then this would be a discipline related to job skill. I think that touches upon, well, specifically that question, but also to what extent does the user report have skills built into it?
It doesn't really. You know, it has it in there at a very, very high level, like, you know, administrators, things like that. One thing that we have been trying to, and I know, Matt, we've had some discussions about this. We've done some work on this at NREL, trying to better understand occupations that are in each sector. And so then we would be able to understand things a little bit more, like, you know, what this means for welders, electricians, scientists, engineers, things like that. But we don't really have those career pathways across the board at this point. So again, I think that would have to be something in the side study. And personally, I would like to see a survey going out to employees in these companies to better understand those occupations and then those age distributions that are with those occupations. And I think that kind of data would be useful not only to understand replacement needs, but then also understand how folks can move into energy sectors that need workers, or better understand how people can transition out of sectors that we see waning demand for, you know, like coal. It's important to know what people in that industry do to help them, you know, do something else if there isn't demand, you know, for the coal fuel.
And I think this touches a little bit about a question that we received from regarding skills specific to the workforce work plan. So Anthony, can you speak a little bit about what the potential of the workforce work plan is? Because I do believe it's a little bit related to that question in a very unique methodology or in a very unique way, trying to get to what type of skills and occupations and type of skills necessary for certain types of occupations tied to DOE technologies. You're on mute, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's the vision that we're shooting for here with the workforce work plan. Is we want ours to be skills based. What unique skills are needed, right, to support these jobs? And a good question here from Deb Lutz. She asked if we've considered integrating what's being done with the state of Pennsylvania's high priority occupation listing. That's where, you know, they talk about what occupations in the state are in demand. And, she mentioned CDL driver's licenses. That's a huge thing, especially with the supply chain issues going on in this country. That's big time right now. Welders has been for a while. And there's a few others that I think you would find at the top of that list. But we haven't considered incorporating that list into ours because ours was based mainly about the technologies that are coming out of our lab and then what skills would be needed to support those in a career field. But that's interesting, though. I think we should, Matt, consider looking at that type of list and cross-referencing it to see what lines up. Because if we say this is the type of job that's going to be tied to a technology coming out of our lab, and it happens to be on that list of high occupational needs in the state, now I think you really have something that we can really emphasize as something that's really needed for the region. So I like that point that Ted made.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions coming in. Let me read this one.
Well, I see one from one of my NREL friends, so I have to. And Sarah asks if there's any plans to add wage data to the survey, and right now we don't. It's kind of a tricky issue. We do have wage data from different reports. We know that energy wages are actually quite a bit higher than average wages nationally, 34% higher. It is not part of the survey right now. Part of the problem is that we really want people to answer the surveys, and asking employers how much they pay their workers is a sensitive question that, even though these are confidential and we're bound by law to make these responses confidential, it is something that a lot of people really balk at answering. And so it isn't something that's in there right now.
I'll tail onto that it is extremely hard to ask questions in a government survey. So there's a lot of work that has to go in for each additional question that you ask to a survey. So I don't envy you whatsoever. But another question coming in about USER in its future. I will try to, if you guys can read it, or it's a little bit long, but paraphrasing it. Is there plans to break out energy efficiency data by state, perhaps congressional district? Application education on data at the state and local level is a very valuable tool. Will you use it to track any jobs specifically tied to AML reclamation or well capping as energy jobs? And a thank you for the data, which is great.
That's a lot. We have had some conversations about some of these things. One of the problems with having a time series is that the time series has to be consistent over time. And so, going back to 2015, it would have been great if we were thinking about things like mitigation efforts, well capping, things like that, but we weren't. And so this is just generally included in, like well capping would be included in petroleum construction. And so that's sort of a clunky way of getting at it, but it is, but we can't break that down specifically. As far as congressional districts go, the best we can get is breaking it down by county. And even those county levels are estimates. One important thing to keep in mind when we do actually report that in the future is that we'll be reporting where we think the jobs are, not where the people are. And so I think, if you're thinking about it from a congressional representative standpoint, you're thinking about your constituents who vote for you, not necessarily, you're probably thinking about the employers too, but those two aren't necessarily the same thing.
I don't know if we have too much time for another question, but I'm paraphrasing this last one. It's essentially reiterating some of the things that would be useful in a new user. If you guys can read that real quick. And some of the limitations, but I think we talked about some of the limitations, especially with respect to wages. And and methodology is always improving, and I know that for sure. But
Can I just chime in really quick?
Sure.
I have a technical suggestion for Colleen Boyle.
Okay.
If you want benefits, use BEA data. Just say that. Use wage data from BEA, not BLS.
So it is now 12, and so I just really want to say it's extremely exciting to see where this user reports come from. Again, it's always transforming. It's always trying to get better. There are obviously many things that would be useful and beneficial. The territories thing is going to be really cool and interesting, especially with respect to trying to get good coverage and good data from U.S. territories. And I think I will close by saying, Anthony, do you have any last words?
I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Really good discussion, Dave. Appreciate your time. A lot of good questions. I know we didn't get a chance to get to all of them, but if you'd like to continue the discussion, I'd say feel free to email myself, Matt, and Dave, and we could try to respond to you or have a continued discussion over email or a phone call. So with that being said, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Right.
Thank you,
guys.
all. Take care.